The dusty streets of Kingfisher, Oklahoma territory stretched out before Florence Lancaster like an endless sentence without punctuation, each building a word she couldn't quite parse in this strange new language of frontier life. She stepped off the stagecoach in September of 1893, her traveling dress already coated with a fine layer of red Oklahoma dirt, and realized with startling clarity that her 3 years at Vassar College had prepared her for absolutely nothing that awaited her here. The other passengers pushed past her without ceremony, their rough manners a sharp contrast to the refined society she had left behind in Boston. And Florence found herself standing alone on the wooden sidewalk with her trunk at her feet, and the afternoon sun beating down with an intensity that made her head swim beneath her proper hat. She had come west to teach, answering an advertisement for a school teacher that had seemed like an adventure when she read it in her father's study 6 weeks ago. Now, watching a cowboy drive a small herd of cattle down the main street, while men spat tobacco juice into the dust and women in faded calico gave her fine clothes suspicious glances, Florence wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. Her father had tried to dissuade her, arguing that an educated woman like herself should marry well and host salons in Boston, not waste her intellect on frontier children who would likely prefer to rope steers than study Shakespeare. But Florence had been suffocated by the expectations of Boston society, where her education was considered an oddity at best and a liability at worst, where men smiled politely at her opinions and then spoke over her as if she hadn't uttered a word. "You, Miss Lancaster?" A weathered woman in her 50s approached, her face lined by wind and sun, but her eyes sharp with intelligence. "Yes, I am. Are you Mrs. Henderson?" Florence had corresponded with the president of the school board, a Margaret Henderson who had written enthusiastic letters about the need for quality education in their growing town. "That would be me. Welcome to Kingfisher. I hope the journey wasn't too difficult." Mrs. Henderson's gaze swept over Florence's expensive traveling suit, her leather gloves, her hat with its single elegant feather, and something that might have been doubt flickered across her features. "Let me help you with your trunk. The schoolhouse is just down this way, and your quarters are attached to it." As they walked through town, Mrs. Henderson pointed out the essential establishments: the general store run by the Mitchells, the saloon that Florence should avoid, the church where Reverend Thompson preached on Sundays, the land office that had been busy since the Cherokee outlet opening just weeks ago. Kingfisher had been established during the land run of 1889, Mrs. Henderson explained, and had grown from a collection of tents to a proper town with wood-frame buildings and ambitions of civilization. The schoolhouse stood at the edge of town, a simple structure with whitewashed walls and a bell tower that seemed almost optimistic in its modest grandeur. The attached quarters consisted of 2 small rooms, a bedroom barely large enough for a narrow bed and washstand, and a sitting room with a pot-belly stove, a table, 2 chairs, and a shelf for books. It was Spartan compared to her room in Boston, with its wallpaper and drapes and comfortable reading chair by the window. But Florence felt something unexpected as she looked around. Possibility. "School starts Monday," Mrs. Henderson said, setting down the trunk. "You'll have about 25 students, ages 6 to 15. Some of the older boys only come when they can spare time from their family farms or ranches. Don't expect perfect attendance." "What texts are available?" Florence asked, already planning lessons in her mind. "We have McGuffey readers, some slates, a handful of arithmetic books. Not much else, I'm afraid. The previous teacher relied mostly on recitation and memorization." Florence nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. She had hoped to teach rhetoric, philosophy, perhaps some Latin. "I brought some of my own books. Perhaps the older students would benefit from exposure to literature, history, the sciences." Mrs. Henderson's expression shifted, something between pity and concern. "Miss Lancaster, most folks here want their children to learn reading, writing, and arithmetic, practical skills. They don't see much use for fancy education. You understand?" "Education is always practical," Florence replied, unable to keep the passion from her voice. "An educated mind can solve problems, can innovate, can see beyond immediate circumstances to future possibilities. Surely the parents want that for their children. What they want is for their boys to run successful ranches and farms, and for their girls to manage households and raise families. That's the reality of frontier life." Mrs. Henderson's tone wasn't unkind, but it was firm. I admire your enthusiasm, truly, but I advise you to temper your expectations. Teach them what they need to know, and don't stir up trouble by putting ideas in their heads that don't fit their lives. After Mrs. Henderson left, Florence sat on the single chair and looked around her new home, feeling the weight of those words. Don't put ideas in their heads. It was the same sentiment she had heard in Boston, dressed in different language. Women shouldn't concern themselves with politics, with science, with philosophy. Stay in your proper sphere. Don't think too much. Don't want too much. Don't be too much. She spent the weekend preparing the schoolhouse, sweeping out the dust, arranging the mismatched desks and benches, writing the alphabet in careful script across the chalkboard. She unpacked her trunk, hanging her few dresses on pegs, arranging her books on the shelf, volumes of Emerson and Thoreau, her collected Shakespeare, a natural history text, her astronomy guide, her cherished copy of Mary Wollstonecraft. She knew she should probably hide them, that their presence would mark her as dangerously intellectual, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. These books were her companions, her consolation, her proof that the life of the mind mattered. Monday morning arrived with a brilliant sunrise that painted the Oklahoma sky in shades of crimson and gold. Florence, dressed in her simplest gown, pinned her dark hair in a neat bun, and stood at the schoolhouse door as families arrived with their children. The students filed in with varying degrees of enthusiasm, the younger ones curious and excited, the older ones skeptical and resistant. One boy, about 14, looked at Florence with open disdain. "You're awful young to be a teacher," he said, his tone challenging. "I'm 22, and I have 3 years of college education," Florence replied evenly, "which is more than sufficient to teach elementary subjects. Your name?" "Billy Carter, and I don't see why I need to be here when I should be helping my pa with the ranch." "Education will serve you well, whether you're ranching or pursuing any other endeavor," Florence said. "Please take a seat." The morning proceeded with Florence assessing each student's level, discovering that most could read simple texts but struggled with comprehension, that their arithmetic skills were basic but functional, that their knowledge of history and science was nearly non-existent. She assigned them readings from the McGuffey readers, but added her own questions, asking them not just to recite but to interpret, to analyze, to think critically about what they read. At lunch, the children scattered outside to eat the meals they had brought. Florence was organizing her afternoon lessons when a shadow fell across her desk. She looked up to find a man standing in the doorway, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing dusty work clothes and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. He removed the hat, revealing sun-bronzed features, dark hair that needed cutting, and eyes the color of creek water, greenish-brown and surprisingly thoughtful. "Miss Lancaster?" His voice was deep but gentle, with the slow cadence of someone who measured his words carefully. "Yes, may I help you?" "I'm Asher Quinn. I have a ranch about 5 miles north of town. I wanted to introduce myself since my nephew attends your school. Tommy Quinn, he's 8 years old." Florence recalled the boy, small for his age with serious eyes and an eagerness to please. "Tommy is a wonderful student, very attentive. He lives with me since his parents passed 2 years ago. Fever took them both within a week." Asher turned his hat in his hands, and Florence noticed how work-worn they were, scarred and calloused. "His ma was educated, like you. She used to read to him every night, taught him his letters before he was 4. I want him to keep learning, to have the opportunities she wanted for him. I'll do everything I can for Tommy and all my students, Mr. Quinn." Florence hesitated, then added, "I notice you said his mother was educated. Do you value education?" Asher met her gaze directly, and Florence felt something shift in the air between them, a recognition of some kind. "I do, though I didn't get much myself. Came out here when I was 16, built my ranch from nothing. But I've always believed that knowledge is worth more than gold. A man who can read can learn anything. A man who can think can solve any problem." "And women?" Florence asked, unable to help herself. "Do you believe the same applies to women?" A slow smile transformed his face, softening the hard lines carved by sun and wind. "My mother taught herself Latin from a book my grandfather left behind. She used to quote Cicero while she churned butter. So, yes, Miss Lancaster, I believe women benefit from education just as much as men do, despite what most folks around here might think." Before Florence could respond, the children began filing back in, and Asher stepped aside. "I should let you return to teaching. Thank you for your time, Miss Lancaster." He settled his hat back on his head and walked away, his stride long and easy, and Florence found herself watching him go with an unexpected flutter in her chest. The afternoon passed with lessons in arithmetic and geography, with Florence pulling down the aged map on the wall and showing her students where Oklahoma Territory sat in relation to the rest of the nation, to the world. She spoke of the oceans they had never seen, of mountains and forests and cities, watching their faces light with wonder. This was why she taught, she reminded herself. These moments when curiosity sparked in young eyes, when minds opened to possibilities beyond their immediate experience. But when the school day ended and the last student departed, Florence felt the isolation settle over her like a heavy cloak. She returned to her small quarters and prepared a simple supper on the pot-belly stove, eating alone at her table with a book propped open before her. In Boston, she had at least had her family, dinners with conversation, even if they didn't always understand her. Here, she had only herself and the vast empty sky pressing down. The weeks that followed established a routine, but not the comfort that routine usually brought. Florence taught her lessons with increasing passion, introducing literature and scientific concepts whenever she could, encouraging her students to question and explore rather than simply memorize. Some of the younger children responded enthusiastically, but the older students and their parents grew resistant. "My son says you're teaching them poetry," one father confronted her after school one October afternoon. "What use is poetry to a boy who'll be running cattle?" "Poetry teaches language skills, emotional intelligence, and creative thinking," Florence explained, "all of which are valuable regardless of profession. It's a waste of time. Teach him practical things, or I'll keep him home." Similar confrontations followed. Florence was too ambitious, too intellectual, too insistent on subjects that didn't matter. She was putting ideas in the children's heads, making them discontent with honest frontier life. She didn't understand their ways, didn't respect their values. The criticism came from all sides, and Florence felt herself becoming defensive, isolated, increasingly certain that she had made a terrible mistake in coming west. The only bright spots were Asher Quinn's occasional visits. He would stop by after school perhaps once a week, ostensibly to check on Tommy's progress, but their conversations invariably ranged beyond that single subject. He asked about the books on her shelf, and when Florence explained transcendentalism to him, he listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed he was truly thinking about the concepts. He lent her a book on ranching that he had studied, and she was surprised to find it full of marginal notes in a neat, careful hand, observations and questions that revealed an analytical mind. "You're self-educated," Florence said during one of these visits in early November, the afternoon light slanting through the schoolhouse windows. "I've tried to be. A man has long hours alone when he's riding fence lines or watching cattle. Books are good company." Asher leaned against her desk, relaxed in a way most men weren't around her. "Though I never had anyone to discuss ideas with. Most cowboys I know think I'm peculiar for reading. I know that feeling well. In Boston, I was considered peculiar for wanting to discuss anything beyond fashion and social gossip." Florence found herself smiling at him, aware of how rare genuine smiles had become since she arrived in Kingfisher. "Their loss," Asher said quietly. "An interesting mind is a gift, not a burden." The way he looked at her when he said it made Florence's breath catch. She had become accustomed to men, either ignoring her intellect or being threatened by it. Asher's appreciation felt like water after a long drought, something essential she hadn't realized she was dying for. "Do you ever regret coming west?" she asked, turning to look out the window at the endless prairie beyond town. "Sometimes. It's a hard life, lonely, but it's mine. I built something here with my own hands. That means something." He moved to stand beside her, following her gaze. "Do you regret coming?" "Every day," Florence admitted, the confession surprising her. "I thought I would find purpose here, students who needed me. Instead, I found people who resent what I offer, who see education as a threat rather than an opportunity. Not everyone feels that way. Enough do. The school board has made it clear that I'm too radical in my methods. Mrs. Henderson says if complaints continue, they may not renew my contract for next year." Asher was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "When my nephew's mother was dying, she made me promise something. She said, 'Don't let him become narrow. Don't let this big sky make his world small. I think about that often. The frontier can make people contract, can make them suspicious of anything unfamiliar. But it doesn't have to. You're trying to expand these children's worlds, and that's valuable even if folks don't recognize it yet. Florence felt tears prick her eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. She blinked them back, but not before Asher noticed. He didn't comment, didn't make her feel weak for the emotion. Instead, he simply said, "Would you have dinner at my ranch this Sunday? Tommy's been asking if you might visit, and I make a decent roast when I put my mind to it. Nothing fancy, but better than eating alone." "That would be lovely," Florence said, and meant it. Sunday arrived clear and cold, winter making its intentions known even in Oklahoma. Asher arrived in town mid-morning, driving a wagon, and Florence climbed up beside him, bundled in her warmest cloak. The ride to his ranch took them through rolling prairie land, the grass golden and dry, interrupted by copses of blackjack oak trees that had already shed their leaves. "I have about 2,000 acres, Asher explained as they drove. "Run about 500 head of cattle. It's not a huge operation, but it's profitable enough. I have 2 hands who help during busy seasons, but mostly it's just me and Tommy working the place." The ranch buildings came into view, a main house constructed of lumber rather than sod, a barn, a bunkhouse, corrals, and outbuildings. It was modest but well-maintained, everything neat and purposeful. Tommy ran out to greet them, his face lit with excitement at seeing his teacher in this new context. The house interior surprised Florence. She had expected the typical bachelor sparseness, but instead found a home that showed care. Curtains on the windows, a braided rug on the floor, books on shelves, even a few framed photographs on the mantel. The furniture was simple but well made, and everything was clean and orderly. "My sister-in-law set up the house before she passed," Asher explained, seeing Florence's expression. "I've tried to maintain it for Tommy's sake. A boy should have a real home, not just a place to sleep." He cooked dinner while Florence and Tommy sat at the kitchen table, and the boy told her about the ranch, about the new calf that had been born the week before, about learning to use a rope. Florence watched Asher move competently around the kitchen, checking the roast in the oven, mashing potatoes, stirring gravy, and felt something warm unfurl in her chest. He was so different from the men she had known in Boston, who would have considered cooking women's work beneath their dignity. The meal was simple but delicious, and the conversation flowed easily. Asher asked Florence about Boston, about her family, about her education. She found herself telling him things she hadn't spoken of to anyone else. How she had fought with her father to attend college, how her mother had worried she would become unmarriageable, how she had dreamed of becoming a professor, but knew no college would hire a woman for such a position. "So teaching seemed like the only way to use my education," Florence said. "But even that is proving more difficult than I imagined. I thought knowledge would be welcomed, but instead it's seen as dangerous." "Change is always seen as dangerous," Asher replied, "especially when people are struggling just to survive. Education seems like a luxury they can't afford. But that's exactly backward. Education is what allows people to improve their circumstances, to move beyond mere survival. I agree with you, but you're fighting against fear, and fear isn't rational." Asher refilled her coffee cup. "My advice, for what it's worth, is to be patient. Teach what you can, how you can. Some seeds take time to grow." After dinner, Tommy showed Florence around the ranch while Asher cleaned up. The boy was bright and curious, asking questions about everything from why leaves changed color to how far away the stars were. Florence answered as best she could, her teacher's heart gladdening at his enthusiasm. When the sun began to lower toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Asher drove Florence back to town. They were quiet on the return journey, but it was a comfortable silence, the kind that exists between people who have begun to understand each other. "Thank you for today," Florence said as they reached the schoolhouse. "It was good to remember that there are people who value what I'm trying to do." "There are more than you might think," Asher said. "They're just quieter than the critics." He helped her down from the wagon, his hand strong and steady on her waist, and Florence felt the warmth of his touch even through the layers of her clothing. "May I call on you again?" "I would like that very much." The visits became regular after that. Asher would come to town on Saturday afternoons, and they would walk together through Kingfisher or along the creek that ran south of town. They talked about everything: philosophy and ranching, literature and cattle breeding, dreams and practicalities. Asher borrowed books from Florence's shelf and returned them with thoughtful observations. Florence asked questions about ranch life and listened to his explanations with genuine interest. The townspeople noticed, of course. In a place like Kingfisher, nothing went unobserved. Florence heard the whispers, saw the knowing looks. Some women seemed pleased, as if her attachment to a local man made her less threatening. Others grew more hostile, as if she didn't deserve the attention of a man like Asher Quinn. "I heard Asher Quinn's been courting the school teacher," Mrs. Mitchell said loudly in the general store one December afternoon, clearly intending Florence to hear. Strange match? A simple rancher and an educated woman. Can't see how that would work. Florence pretended not to hear, but the words stung. She wasn't ashamed of her feelings for Asher, but she worried about the truth in Mrs. Mitchell's observation. Could she be happy as a rancher's wife, living in isolation, giving up her teaching? Could Asher be happy with a woman whose mind constantly reached beyond the practical concerns of frontier life? She raised these concerns during their next walk, the air crisp with winter cold, the prairie grass crunching beneath their feet. "Do you think we're too different?" she asked, not looking at him. "You've built a life here that's grounded in the land, in physical work. My life has been about ideas, about intellectual pursuits. Those worlds seem incompatible." Asher was quiet for several paces. Then he said, "I don't think they are incompatible at all. A ranch requires intellectual work too, just applied differently. I have to understand animal behavior, weather patterns, market economics. I have to solve problems every day, plan for the future, adapt to changing circumstances. That's all intellectual work. But it's practical knowledge, directly applicable. What I love is knowledge for its own sake, philosophy and literature and science that may never have direct application. Who says it won't? When Tommy asked me last week why the cattle bunch together in cold weather, I thought about something you said about how penguin colonies huddle for warmth, and I explained the concept of shared heat to him. That's you teaching me something that I taught him, knowledge crossing from one realm to another. Asher stopped walking and turned to face her. "Florence, I don't love you despite your education. I love you because of it, because your mind is beautiful and fascinating, because talking with you makes me think in new ways." Florence's breath caught. "You love me?" "I do. Have for weeks now. Maybe since that first day when you looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language by saying, I valued what my mother had taught herself." He reached out and took her hand, his rough fingers gentle on hers. "I know I'm not what you imagine for yourself. I'm just a cowboy with calloused hands and dust on my boots. But I value your mind and your heart more than anything else in this world." Tears spilled down Florence's cheeks, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of being seen, truly seen, for who she was. "I love you too," she whispered. "I didn't think I could, didn't think I should. I kept telling myself we were too different. But you're the only person here who understands me, who doesn't want me to be smaller than I am." Asher pulled her into his arms, and Florence rested her head against his chest, hearing the steady beat of his heart through his coat. They stood that way for a long moment, two people who had each been lonely, finding unexpected completion in each other. "Will you marry me?" Asher asked, his voice rumbling through his chest. "I know it means giving up teaching, and I know how much that matters to you. But you could teach Tommy at home, and maybe someday we'll have children of our own for you to teach. And I promise I'll never ask you to be less than you are." Florence pulled back to look at him. "The school board is unlikely to renew my contract anyway. Mrs. Henderson told me last week that the complaints have become too numerous. I'm too radical, too unwilling to conform to their expectations." She smiled through her tears. "So yes, I'll marry you. But I have one condition." "Name it." "I want to keep my books, and I want space in our home for them. I want to be able to read and study and pursue knowledge even as I manage a household." "I'll build you a library," Asher promised. "The room next to ours can be lined with shelves. You'll have a desk by the window where the light is good, and a comfortable chair, and all the time you need for reading and thinking." They married 2 weeks before Christmas in the small church in Kingfisher, with Tommy standing as Asher's best man and Mrs. Henderson, who had grown fond of Florence despite their disagreements, standing as witness. The ceremony was simple, attended by a handful of townspeople, some curious, some genuinely well-wishing. Florence wore a dress of deep blue wool, practical for winter, but with lace at the collar and cuffs that gave it elegance. Asher wore his best suit, his hair neatly trimmed, his eyes never leaving Florence's face as they spoke their vows. Afterward, they rode to the ranch in the wagon, Tommy chattering excitedly about how wonderful it would be to have Florence living with them always. Snow began falling as they traveled, light flakes that caught in Florence's hair and melted on her cheeks. The world felt clean and new, full of possibility. The reality of ranch life proved both harder and more rewarding than Florence had anticipated. She rose before dawn with Asher, making breakfast while he did the morning chores, then spending the mornings teaching Tommy his lessons while managing the household tasks, washing, mending, cooking, cleaning. The work was endless and exhausting, so different from the intellectual labor she was accustomed to. But there were unexpected joys too. She learned to bake bread, the satisfaction of watching dough rise and transform in the oven. She learned to garden, planning where vegetables would grow come spring. She learned about cattle, riding out with Asher to check on the herd, beginning to recognize individual animals and understand their behaviors. She learned the rhythm of ranch life, the way it connected directly to the land and seasons in a way her previous existence never had. And every evening, after Tommy was in bed and the dishes were washed, she and Asher would sit together in the main room, she with a book and he with ranch accounts or mending to do, and they would talk. They discussed the books she read, the ideas they contained, the questions they raised. Asher proved to have a natural philosophical bent, able to engage with complex concepts and offer insights that surprised and delighted Florence. "You should have gone to college," she told him one February evening as they debated Emerson's concept of self-reliance. "Maybe in another life, but I don't regret the education I've given myself. It's been organic, driven by genuine curiosity rather than curriculum requirements." He looked up from the harness he was repairing. "Though I do sometimes wish I had someone to write down my thoughts for, some way to contribute to larger conversations." "You could write essays," Florence suggested, "about ranching, about frontier life, about the intersection of physical labor and intellectual thought. I would be happy to help you edit them, and we could seek publication." Asher looked skeptical. Who would want to read a cowboy's philosophical musings? "I would, and I suspect others would too. There's a hunger for authentic voices, for perspectives beyond the ivory tower." Florence set down her book, warming to the idea. "Think about it, Asher. You have something valuable to say about how to live thoughtfully even in circumstances that demand constant physical labor, about finding meaning in simple work, about building a life that honors both practical necessity and higher aspirations." Over the following months, Asher began writing in the evenings, filling pages with observations and reflections. Florence read everything he produced, offering suggestions, encouraging him when he grew discouraged. His prose was rougher than academic writing, but it had an honesty and vigor that academic writing often lacked. Together, they polished several essays, and Florence sent them to publications in the East, to magazines and journals she had read during her college years. Spring came to Oklahoma with dramatic swiftness, the prairie exploding into wildflowers, the cattle giving birth to calves that tottered on unsteady legs. Florence worked in her garden, planting seeds and watching the miracle of growth with new appreciation. Tommy flourished under her daily tutelage, advancing far beyond where he had been in the town school. And in May, a letter arrived from the Atlantic Monthly accepting one of Asher's essays, Thoughts from a Prairie Ranch, on work, solitude, and the examined life. The payment was modest, but the validation was immense. Asher held the acceptance letter with something like awe. "They want more," he said, reading and rereading the editor's note. "They say my perspective is fresh and needed." "I told you," Florence said, unable to contain her smile. "You have important things to say." That summer brought another change. Florence discovered she was pregnant. The realization filled her with a complex mix of emotions. Joy certainly at the thought of a child with Asher, but also fear at the physical demands and dangers of childbirth on the frontier, and a strange grief at how completely her life had diverged from the academic path she had once imagined. "Are you happy about it?" Asher asked when she told him, searching her face. "Yes," Florence said, and realized she meant it. "Yes, I'm happy. This isn't the life I planned, but it's become a life I love. And our child will be fortunate to have you as a father. And you as a mother. You'll teach our children to think, to question, to reach beyond what they can see from our porch. That's a precious gift." The pregnancy progressed through the hot Oklahoma summer, Florence continued her daily routines as much as her growing body allowed, teaching Tommy, managing the household, working in her garden. Asher was protective without being overbearing, insisting she rest more, taking on additional household tasks without being asked. In September, another letter arrived, this one from Vassar College. Florence opened it with trembling hands, wondering what her alma mater could possibly want with her. The letter was from a professor she had studied with, a woman named Dr. Harriet Whitman, who taught philosophy. She had read Asher's essay in the Atlantic Monthly, and had been intrigued by the biographical note mentioning that he lived on an Oklahoma ranch with his wife, Florence Lancaster Quinn, herself a Vassar graduate. Dr. Whitman wrote that the college was developing a new program examining women's experiences in various spheres of American life. Would Florence be interested in writing about her experience as an educated woman on the frontier, about the challenges and unexpected rewards of applying intellectual training to practical life? The college would pay for such essays and potentially compile them into a book with similar pieces from other women. Florence read the letter 3 times, hardly daring to believe it. Here was an opportunity to return to intellectual work, to contribute to larger conversations, to be part of the academic world she had thought lost to her forever. "You should do it," Asher said when she showed him the letter. "You have so much to say about education on the frontier, about the resistance you faced, about how learning applies to all aspects of life. But with the baby coming, and all the work here, we'll manage. This is important, Florence. Your voice matters." So, Florence began writing, working in the library Asher had built for her, her notebooks spread across the desk, her books pulled from the shelves for reference. She wrote about her first months in Kingfisher, about the clash between her educational ideals and frontier pragmatism. She wrote about learning to value different kinds of knowledge, how to read weather signs in the sky, how to nurse a sick calf back to health, how to make a home in an unforgiving land. She wrote about the false dichotomy between intellectual and physical labor, between education and practical skill. And she wrote about love, about finding a partner who valued her mind and heart, who saw education not as a threat, but as an enhancement to their shared life. The baby came in February of 1895, a cold night with wind howling around the ranch house. The doctor from Kingfisher arrived in time to assist, and after long hours of labor, Florence gave birth to a son. They named him Samuel, after Asher's father, and he had his mother's dark eyes and his father's strong features. Holding her son for the first time, exhausted and overwhelmed, Florence felt the world reorganize around this new reality. All her theories about education, about intellectual development, about the life of the mind, suddenly became urgent and personal. This child would need her to be both mother and teacher, to prepare him for the world while nurturing his individual spirit. "He's perfect," Asher whispered, his finger caught in Samuel's tiny fist. "Look at how he grips, how strong he already is." "He'll be a thinker and a doer," Florence said. "He'll know both books and land, ideas and work." As Samuel grew, Florence and Asher established rhythms that honored both their commitments. Florence wrote her essays during Samuel's nap times, her words coming more slowly now, but perhaps more deeply, filtered through the lens of motherhood and manual labor. Asher continued his own writing, his essays gaining a small but devoted readership. Together, they taught Tommy, who at 12 was reading college-level texts while also learning advanced ranching skills. In the spring of 1896, Florence's essays were published as part of a collection titled Women's Voices from the American Frontier. The book received positive reviews in Eastern publications, with critics praising the authentic perspectives and intellectual rigor. Several reviewers specifically mentioned Florence's pieces, noting how she challenged assumptions about the incompatibility of education and frontier life. The book's publication brought unexpected consequences. A wealthy philanthropist in Boston read Florence's essays and was moved by her description of the lack of educational resources in Oklahoma Territory. He contacted her, proposing to fund a lending library in Kingfisher, one that would serve the entire community with books on all subjects. Florence brought the proposal to Mrs. Henderson and the town council. There was initial resistance from some quarters, concerns about inappropriate books corrupting young minds. But Florence, now confident in ways she hadn't been as a young teacher, made a passionate case. "Knowledge is not dangerous," she argued at the town meeting. "Ignorance is dangerous. A library would serve everyone, from children learning to read to adults seeking to improve their circumstances. It would cost the town nothing, a gift from a generous donor who believes in the potential of frontier communities. The proposal passed, and in the fall of 1896, the Kingfisher Public Library opened in a small building near the school. Florence served on the library board, helping to select books and organize programs. She held reading groups for women, discussing literature and current events. She organized science demonstrations for children. Slowly, gradually, the town's attitude toward education began to shift. The following years brought continued growth and change. Tommy graduated from the ranch schooling Florence provided and went to work full-time with Asher, proving himself a skilled and thoughtful rancher. Florence had a daughter in 1897, naming her Ellen after her mother, and then another son in 1899 named Charles. The ranch prospered, Asher's careful management and expanding herd bringing increasing financial security. Both Florence and Asher continued writing, their essays appearing in various publications. They gained a reputation as frontier intellectuals, living proof that education and practical life could not only coexist, but enrich each other. Scholars and journalists occasionally made the journey to their ranch, seeking interviews, marveling at this unlikely center of thought and learning in the Oklahoma Territory. But more important than public recognition was the life they built together. Every evening after the children were in bed and the day's work was done, Florence and Asher sat together in their main room, books and papers spread around them, talking through ideas and problems and dreams. They challenged each other intellectually, supported each other emotionally, and built a partnership that honored both their practical needs and their higher aspirations. "Do you ever regret it?" Asher asked one evening in 1900, as a new century stretched before them, full of possibility. Leaving Boston, giving up the chance to live in an intellectual center? Florence looked around their home, at the children sleeping in their rooms, at the books lining the walls, at the papers scattered across the desk that represented their ongoing work, at Asher's face lit by lamplight, still handsome after 7 years of marriage, still fascinating to talk to. "I have no regrets," she said honestly. "I thought education meant living among educated people in cities, working in established institutions. But I've learned that education is something you carry with you, something you can practice anywhere. I'm educating our children, contributing to intellectual conversations through our writing, helping to build a literate community here in Kingfisher. That's more meaningful than anything I might have done in Boston. And you don't feel your education was wasted on frontier life? On the contrary, I feel my education is fully utilized here in ways it never could have been in Boston. There, I would have been ornamental, expected to show my learning in parlor conversations, but never to actually apply it to real problems. Here, I use every bit of knowledge I possess every single day. I use science in my garden and in nursing sick animals. I use mathematics in household management. I use philosophy in raising our children to be thoughtful people. I use literature to understand human nature and my own experiences. Nothing is wasted." Asher smiled, that slow, warm smile that still made Florence's heart skip. "You've taught me so much," he said. "Not just book knowledge, though there's been plenty of that, but you've taught me to see my own work differently, to value the intellectual aspects of ranching, to believe my thoughts are worth recording and sharing. You've made me larger than I was." "And you've done the same for me," Florence replied. "You've taught me to value practical knowledge, to see the dignity in physical labor, to understand that the life of the mind doesn't require an ivory tower. You've shown me that an educated woman can be fully herself even as a rancher's wife, that I don't have to choose between my intellect and my heart." They reached for each other across the space between their chairs, hands meeting and clasping, a connection that had grown stronger with each passing year. In 1901, Florence received an invitation that seemed to complete a circle. Vassar College was hosting a symposium on women's education and its applications, and they wanted Florence to speak about her experiences. The college would pay for her travel and accommodation, and she could bring her family if she wished. "We should go," Asher said immediately when she told him. "You should have the chance to return to where your education began, to show them what you've done with it." So in October of that year, the Quinn family traveled east by train. For the children, ages 6, 4, and 2, it was an overwhelming adventure. For Florence, it was a strange homecoming, returning to a place that had shaped her, but that she had left behind. The Vassar campus looked exactly as she remembered. The gracious buildings, the manicured grounds, the young women walking purposefully between classes with books under their arms. But Florence saw it differently now, understood that what happened in these buildings was only the beginning of education, not its culmination. Her lecture was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon in one of the college's larger halls. Florence had prepared carefully, wanting to do justice to the complex truths she had learned. Asher sat in the front row with Tommy, now 19, and looking uncomfortable in his city clothes, while friends in town watched the younger children for the afternoon. Florence spoke for nearly an hour, telling the story of her journey from ambitious Vassar graduate to struggling frontier teacher to rancher's wife, writer, and community educator. She spoke honestly about her initial failures and prejudices, about her assumptions that education meant one specific kind of life lived in one specific kind of place. She spoke about learning to value different forms of knowledge, about finding intellectual fulfillment in unexpected contexts, about building a partnership that honored both mind and heart. "I came west believing I was bringing civilization to a backward place," she said near the end of her lecture. "I was insufferably arrogant in my assumptions. What I discovered was a different kind of civilization, one built on direct engagement with land and weather and survival, one that required constant problem-solving and adaptation. The people I once pitied for their lack of formal education possessed deep knowledge earned through observation and experience. My education didn't become useful until I learned to integrate it with this other kind of knowing, until I stopped seeing practical and intellectual knowledge as opposed to each other. The challenge for educated women, I believe, is not to abandon our learning when we enter spheres that society deems incompatible with education. The challenge is to bring our full selves to whatever life we choose, to trust that education enhances every endeavor, and to resist the false dichotomies that would have us choose between our minds and our hearts, between thought and action, between intellectual and practical life. I am a rancher's wife, a mother, a homemaker, and I am also a thinker, a writer, an educator. These identities do not conflict, they enrich each other. My Vassar education was not wasted on frontier life. It was essential to frontier life. And frontier life has been essential to making my education something living and real rather than merely ornamental. The applause when she finished was enthusiastic and prolonged. Afterward, dozens of young women surrounded her with questions. What books should they read? How could they prepare for lives that might not follow conventional paths? How could they hold on to their intellectual identities if they married and had children? Florence answered as honestly as she could, emphasizing that there was no single right path, that each woman had to discover what combination of roles and activities would allow her to be fully herself. Later, at a reception, Dr. Whitman pulled Florence aside. "You've done something remarkable," she said. "You've shown that education isn't about conforming to a specific lifestyle, but about developing capacities that serve you wherever life takes you. That's the most important lesson we can teach our students, but it's one many of them won't fully understand until they've lived as long as you have." "I'm still learning it myself," Florence admitted, "still discovering new ways to integrate the different parts of my life." On the train back to Oklahoma, Florence sat with Asher while the children slept in their compartment. She watched the landscape change outside the window, the eastern forests giving way to plains, and felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this moment. "I'm proud of you," Asher said quietly. "The way you spoke today, the ideas you articulated, the questions you answered, you're making a real contribution to how people think about education and women's roles." "We're making a contribution," Florence corrected. "Your essays have been just as important in showing that intellectual life isn't restricted to academics, that working people can engage with ideas in meaningful ways." "Partners in every sense," Asher agreed, taking her hand. The years that followed were full and rich. The children grew, each developing their own personalities and interests. Samuel proved to be a natural scholar, reading voraciously and asking endless questions about how things worked. Ellen was more practical, drawn to the hands-on work of ranch life, but approaching it with systematic intelligence. Charles was still too young to show clear inclinations, but he was affectionate and observant. Florence and Asher continued their intellectual partnership, writing and publishing, discussing and debating. The library in Kingfisher thrived, becoming a true community center. The town itself changed, growing more prosperous as Oklahoma Territory moved toward statehood, which was achieved in 1907. With statehood came improved educational opportunities. A proper school was built in Kingfisher, with multiple teachers and better resources. Florence was asked to join the school board, where she advocated for a curriculum that balanced practical skills with liberal education, that prepared students for frontier life while also exposing them to broader worlds. Tommy married in 1904, choosing a young woman named Sarah, who had grown up on a neighboring ranch. They built a house on the Quinn property, and Tommy took over increasing responsibility for the ranch operations, allowing Asher more time for writing and community involvement. Florence helped Sarah adjust to married life, passing on skills and knowledge just as she had once received them. In 1910, when Florence was 39 and Asher 43, they received word that a publishing house in New York wanted to compile their essays into a single volume, along with an extended introduction explaining their partnership and philosophy. Frontier Intellectuals, Essays on Work, Education, and Examined Life, was published in 1911 and received respectful attention, finding its way onto reading lists at several colleges and universities. The book's success brought more visitors to the ranch, young people seeking guidance on how to live intellectually engaged lives outside traditional academic settings. Florence and Asher welcomed these visitors, opening their home and their library, sharing what they had learned through trial and error. "We've become accidental teachers," Asher observed one evening after a group of young writers had departed. "I don't think it's accidental," Florence replied. "We've always been teachers, just not always in formal settings. Every conversation is a kind of teaching, every shared idea an act of education." The children pursued their own paths as they grew. Samuel went to the State University in 1913, studying engineering and dreaming of building bridges that would connect isolated communities. Ellen declared she wanted to be a veterinarian, a challenging ambition for a woman, but one her parents supported without hesitation. Charles showed early aptitude for music, somehow teaching himself to play the piano in the church and begging for an instrument of their own. By 1915, the ranch was well established and profitable. The children were launched or launching, and Florence and Asher found themselves entering a new phase of life. They were no longer young pioneers struggling to build something from nothing. They were established community members, successful in their various endeavors, respected for their contributions. "Do you remember that first day in the schoolhouse?" Florence asked one autumn evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the prairie. "When you came to ask about Tommy?" "I remember thinking you were the most interesting person I'd ever met," Asher said, "and the most challenging. You made me want to be smarter, to think more deeply. I remember thinking you were different from other men I'd encountered. You listened to me, really listened, as if what I said mattered." "It did matter. It does matter." Asher pulled her closer on the porch swing they had installed years ago. "Everything you've thought and said and written has mattered, Florence. You've changed lives, starting with mine. And you've changed mine. You taught me that education isn't about where you live or what work you do. It's about how you approach life, how you think about your experiences, how you engage with the world and with other minds." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the colors shift across the vast Oklahoma sky. 22 years of marriage, years full of work and love, challenge and growth, isolation and community. Florence thought about the young woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in Kingfisher in 1893, so certain of what education meant, so unprepared for the actual lessons frontier life would teach her. She had been too educated for the frontier, only in the sense that her education was incomplete. She had learned facts and theories, but not their application. She had developed her mind, but not her hands. She had read about life, but not fully lived it. The frontier and Asher had completed her education in ways Vassar never could have. "I want to write something new," Florence said suddenly. "Not an essay, but maybe a longer work, about women's education, about what we really need to learn to live full lives." "What would you include?" Asher asked, always interested in her projects. "Everything. Literature and science, yes, but also practical skills. Philosophy and household management. How to think critically and how to solve immediate problems. How to be both intellectual and physical, contemplative and active. How to value different kinds of knowledge without creating hierarchies. How to find partners who enhance rather than diminish us. How to build lives that honor all of who we are. That's ambitious. I've never been good at thinking small, Florence said with a smile. She began the book the next week, working steadily through the winter months. It was the most sustained writing project she had undertaken, requiring her to organize years of experience and reflection into coherent arguments. Asher read each chapter as she completed it, offering feedback and suggestions, sometimes contributing sections from his own perspective. The work was published in 1917 as The Whole Education, Preparing Women for Complete Lives. It found an eager audience among both educators and general readers, women seeking guidance on how to navigate the competing demands and expectations they faced. Florence received letters from across the country, from young women planning their futures and older women reflecting on their choices, all grateful for her validation of the complex, multifaceted lives they wanted to lead, or were already leading. The First World War touched even their remote corner of Oklahoma. Samuel, now 22, enlisted in the engineering corps and spent 2 years in France building bridges and roads. His letters home were full of observations about the devastation of war, but also about the practical applications of his education, how he used physics and mathematics and creative problem-solving every day. Florence worried constantly, but was proud of his service. When Samuel returned in 1919, he was changed, quieter, but also more purposeful. He had met a French woman, a teacher named Marie, and wanted to bring her to America as his wife. Florence and Asher welcomed her warmly, this young woman who had survived occupation and loss with her grace and spirit intact. Marie spoke excellent English and proved to be another intellectual companion, bringing European perspectives to their ongoing conversations. Ellen achieved her dream, becoming one of the first female veterinarians in Oklahoma through sheer determination and excellent academic work. She set up a practice serving the ranches around Kingfisher, and her expertise was soon in high demand. She brought scientific understanding to animal care, improving breeding programs and disease prevention throughout the region. Charles, at 18, was still finding his path. His musical talent had developed beyond anything anyone expected, and he dreamed of attending a conservatory in the East. Florence and Asher supported this ambition even though it meant another child leaving, understanding that their role was to prepare their children for the lives they wanted, not the lives their parents had imagined for them. By 1920, as Florence approached 50, she looked around at what she and Asher had built and felt deep satisfaction. Not the smug satisfaction of someone whose plans had worked out perfectly, but the earned satisfaction of someone who had adapted, persevered, learned, and grown. The ranch prospered under Tommy's capable management. Their children were thriving, pursuing meaningful work. The community they had helped shape valued education alongside practical skills, and their partnership remained strong, still characterized by mutual respect, intellectual engagement, and deep love. "We did well," Asher said one evening, echoing her thoughts. They were in the library, surrounded by books, papers scattered across both desks as they worked on separate projects, but in companionable proximity. "We did," Florence agreed, "though it didn't look like we would at first. I was so unhappy those first months in Kingfisher, so certain I had made a terrible mistake." "What changed?" "You," Florence said simply. "You showed me that education and frontier life weren't incompatible, that I could bring my whole self to this place. You valued what I had been taught to see as liabilities, my learning, my questions, my need for intellectual stimulation. You made space for all of me." "You did the same for me," Asher replied. "You took seriously my ideas and observations, treated my self-education as legitimate, encouraged me to write and share my thinking. You made me believe I had something valuable to contribute beyond physical labor." "We saved each other," Florence said. "We completed each other," Asher corrected. "There's a difference. We were both whole people before we met, but together we became more than we could have been separately." Florence rose from her desk and went to him, settling onto his lap the way she still sometimes did, despite being a grandmother. Asher's arms came around her, strong and sure, and she rested her head on his shoulder. "I love you," she said. "After 27 years, I love you more than I did when we married." "The feeling is entirely mutual," Asher murmured against her hair. They remained that way for a long while, two people who had found in each other what they hadn't known they were seeking: acceptance, partnership, challenge, and home. The 1920s brought continued change and growth. Oklahoma was no longer a frontier, but an established state with cities and industries. The ranch adapted to changing markets, incorporating new agricultural techniques. Samuel and Marie had children, two daughters who visited the ranch regularly and called Florence and Asher by affectionate names in both English and French. Ellen's veterinary practice expanded, and she took on a younger woman as an apprentice, passing on knowledge just as it had been passed to her. Charles thrived at conservatory and began performing professionally, his concerts occasionally bringing him back to Oklahoma, where proud family members filled the front rows. Florence continued writing and speaking, now recognized as an authority on women's education and frontier life. But she also enjoyed quieter pursuits, working in her garden, reading for pleasure rather than research, playing with her grandchildren, taking long walks with Asher across the land they had worked together for decades. In 1925, Vassar College invited Florence to return for their 50th reunion. The college was celebrating its growth and evolution, showcasing alumnae who had made meaningful contributions in various fields. Florence was honored as an example of someone who had taken her education into unexpected territories and used it to effect real change. At the reunion, Florence met women she had studied with, comparing notes on the paths their lives had taken. Some had married wealthy men and lived comfortable urban lives. Some had remained single and pursued careers in teaching, medicine, or social work. Some, like Florence, had combined marriage, motherhood, and intellectual work in various configurations. What struck Florence was how many of them spoke enviously of her life, of the partnership she described with Asher, of the integration she had achieved between different aspects of herself. The women who had seemed to have everything: wealth, status, leisure, often felt unfulfilled, restless, confined by expectations and social roles. The women who had pursued careers often felt isolated, defensive about their choices, exhausted by constant battles against prejudice. "You found a third way," one former classmate said. "Neither complete conformity nor complete rebellion. You made a life that honored everything you are." Florence had never thought of it quite that way, but she supposed it was true. She hadn't abandoned education for marriage, or marriage for education. She hadn't sacrificed her intellect for her family, or her family for her intellect. She had, with Asher's essential support, created a life that made space for all of her commitments and identities. On the train back to Oklahoma, Florence reflected on the reunion, on the lives she had glimpsed, on the choices that had brought her to where she was. She thought about the young woman she had been, so certain and so naive, who had boarded a stagecoach west with her trunk of books and her head full of ideals. That woman had needed to be broken down and rebuilt, had needed to learn humility and flexibility, had needed to discover that education was the beginning of wisdom, not its completion. But that young woman's core beliefs had been sound. Education did matter, desperately. Knowledge was valuable, could change lives, could create possibilities. What Florence had learned was that education had to be relevant to lived experience, had to engage with real problems and real people, had to be applied with humility and openness to learning from multiple sources. Asher met her at the station in Kingfisher, his face lighting up when he saw her, and Florence felt her heart swell with love and gratitude. 32 years of marriage, and he still made her feel cherished, valued, understood. "Welcome home," he said, taking her bag and offering his arm. "It's good to be home," Florence replied, and meant it with her whole heart. The final years of the 1920s passed peacefully. Florence and Asher slowed their pace somewhat, allowing younger generations to take over more responsibilities. Tommy ran the ranch with his sons now helping, creating a third generation of Quinns working the land. Samuel's engineering firm prospered. Ellen's practice continued to thrive. Charles's musical career brought him recognition and satisfaction. Florence's last book, published in 1929, was a memoir called An Educated Life, From Boston to the Oklahoma Frontier. It was her most personal work, telling the full story of her journey, her struggles, her marriage, her work. Critics called it a valuable historical document and a moving love story. Readers saw their own struggles reflected in her pages, their own attempts to live whole lives in a world that insisted on fragmentation. In the fall of 1930, as Florence and Asher sat on their porch watching yet another spectacular Oklahoma sunset, they reviewed their lives with satisfaction and peace. The ranch that Asher had built through hard work and determination stretched around them, prosperous and well managed. The children they had raised together were thriving, each in their own way. The community they had helped shape valued both practical skills and education, both hard work and intellectual inquiry. The partnership they had forged across their differences had proven strong enough to weather decades. "No regrets?" Asher asked, a question they returned to periodically. "No regrets," Florence confirmed. Everything that seemed like a mistake or a compromise at the time turned out to be necessary. Every difficulty taught me something essential. Every challenge made me stronger or wiser or both. "I regret that we won't live forever," Asher said quietly. "I'd like more time with you. 1,000 years wouldn't be enough." Florence laced her fingers through his. "We've had 37 years of marriage and years of friendship before that. That's more than many people get, and we've made the most of every one of those years." "That we have," Asher agreed. They sat in silence as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the prairie in shades of orange and crimson and gold. The wind rustled through the grass, carrying the scent of earth and growing things. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed. The sounds were familiar, beloved, the soundtrack of the life they had built together. "You know what I'm most proud of?" Florence asked. "Tell me." "That we created something bigger than ourselves, not just our children, though I'm proud of them, but the ideas we put into the world through our writing, the changes we helped bring about in how people think about education and frontier life and women's capabilities. The library in town, the school board's improved curriculum, the young people we've mentored, all of that will continue after we're gone. We've contributed to progress, however modestly." "Not so modestly," Asher objected. "Your books are read at universities. My essays are still being published. Ellen is training the next generation of veterinarians. Samuel is designing infrastructure that will serve communities for decades. That's real legacy." "Our real legacy is each other," Florence said. "The partnership we created, the example we set of what marriage can be when both people are truly valued. That's what I want to be remembered for." They remained on the porch until full dark, then went inside to their library, to their books and papers, and the work that still engaged them even as they aged. They read aloud to each other as they had done for decades, sharing passages that struck them, discussing ideas that sparked their curiosity, simply enjoying the pleasure of each other's company and each other's minds. The years continued to pass, bringing new grandchildren, new publications, new developments in their community and nation. The Great Depression touched even Oklahoma, but the ranch weathered it better than many enterprises, diversified and well managed as it was. Florence and Asher lived to see their oldest grandchildren marry and start families of their own, creating a fourth generation that would carry forward the values they had worked to instill. In 1940, as Florence approached 70, Vassar College established the Florence Lancaster Quinn Fellowship for women pursuing education in non-traditional settings or applying their education in innovative ways. The honor touched Florence deeply. This recognition that her path, which had seemed so uncertain and unconventional, had value worth celebrating and supporting in others. Asher, now 73, remained active on the ranch, still riding out to check fences and cattle, still writing essays about the intersection of thought and work. His mind remained sharp, engaged, curious about the world, even as his body showed the inevitable effects of decades of hard physical labor. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary in December of 1943, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, by friends from Kingfisher and colleagues from across the country who had come to honor their partnership. The celebration was joyful, full of stories and laughter, music and dancing. Late in the evening, Florence and Asher slipped away from the festivities to their library, seeking a quiet moment alone together. 50 years, Florence said wonderingly. "When I married you, I couldn't imagine 50 years of anything." "And now?" Asher asked. "Now I can't imagine anything else. You've been my partner in every sense, in work, in thought, in raising children, in building a life. You've challenged me and supported me, infuriated me and delighted me, made me better than I could have been alone." "The feeling is entirely mutual," Asher said, echoing words he had spoken many times over the decades. "You took a simple cowboy and taught him to see the world in new ways, to value his own thoughts, to believe he had something to contribute beyond physical labor." "You were never simple," Florence corrected. You had depth and intelligence that just needed validation and encouragement. I saw what was already there. And you, Asher said softly, were never too educated for the frontier. You were exactly educated enough to see possibilities others missed, to bridge different kinds of knowledge, to teach in ways that transformed people. Kingfisher, Oklahoma Territory needed Florence Lancaster more than Boston ever did. Florence felt tears gathering, the good kind that came from overwhelming emotion rather than sadness. I needed you, she whispered. I needed someone who valued my mind and heart, who saw me as a whole person rather than an ornamental educated woman or a workhorse frontier wife. You gave me permission to be everything I was. They held each other in the library that had been the scene of so much shared work and thought over the decades, two people who had found in each other the perfect partner for the lives they wanted to lead. Florence lived to 82, passing peacefully in her sleep in 1952, with Asher holding her hand. She had continued writing almost until the end, her last essay published just weeks before her death, still thinking, still questioning, still contributing. Asher followed her less than a year later, the ranch he had built passing to capable hands, but his heart broken by the loss of his partner. Their funeral was attended by hundreds, family members from across the country, former students, colleagues and collaborators, townspeople whose lives they had touched. The Kingfisher Public Library held a memorial service where people read from Florence's books and shared memories of her impact. The ranch hosted a gathering where Asher's essays were discussed and his life celebrated. But the truest memorial was the lives they had shaped, the ideas they had put into the world, the example they had set of what partnership and commitment and intellectual engagement could look like. Their children carried forward their values, raising their own children to be both thoughtful and practical, educated and grounded. The students Florence had taught, whether in the schoolhouse or through her writing, approached their own lives with more intention because of her influence. The community they had helped build continued to value both education and hard work, understanding that the two enhanced rather than opposed each other. And the story of the educated woman who came west and found not limitation, but liberation, who married a cowboy who valued her mind and heart, who built a partnership that honored both intellectual and practical life, continued to inspire generations of women and men seeking to live whole, integrated, examined lives. In the library of the Quinn Ranch, which was preserved as a historical site in the 1960s, visitors could see the shelves of books that Florence and Asher had shared, the desks where they had worked side by side, the handwritten manuscripts and published volumes that represented their collaborative intellectual project. A plaque near the door read, "Here two people prove that education knows no boundaries, that love can bridge any difference, and that the examined life is available to anyone, anywhere, who has the courage to pursue it." It was a fitting tribute to Florence Lancaster, Quinn and Asher Quinn, two remarkable individuals who had created something even more remarkable together, a life of meaning, purpose, partnership, and love that served as a beacon for all who sought to live authentically and whole.